Hello and welcome to Sticky Notes, the classical music podcast. My name is Joshua Weilerstein. I'm a conductor, and I'm the music director of the Orchestra Nationale de Lille and the chief conductor of the Aalborg Symphony. This podcast is for anyone who loves classical music, works in the field, or is just getting ready to dive in to this amazing world of incredible music. Before we get started, I want to thank my new Patreon sponsors, Damon, Chris, Casey, Terrence, Gio, Kit, George, Lisa Marie, Robbie, LaRue, Giselle, Fiona, Judy, Daniel, and all of my other Patreon sponsors for making Season 10 possible. If you'd like to support the show, please head over to patreon.com/stickynotespodcast. And if you are a fan of the show, please just take a moment to give us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. It is greatly appreciated. So quite a few announcements this week before we start the show. First of all, I will be in Lille this week for my first official week as the music director of the Orchestra Nationale de Lille. We're doing a program with Mahler's Fifth Symphony and Liszt's Second Piano Concerto with Alexander Kantorov. It's safe to say I cannot wait for this performance, these three performances actually, of this symphony which has been really living with me for the last year, and of course to work with Alexander Kantorov, who's one of the great pianists of our generation, for the very first time. In terms of the podcast, of course, all of you know I've been doing episodes every 2 weeks due to my work schedule and also having a new baby. That will continue after November, but for about a 6-week period starting this week, I will be going back to releasing a show every week. And that is because, for what I think are obvious reasons, I will be doing a series of shows on American composers, starting, of course, today with Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. The rest of this series will be a couple of older episodes, couple of new episodes, and there will also be one very special episode on Copland's Appalachian Spring. And this will be a live episode that will be airing on October 5th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. And this will be a show which is a little bit like the Patreon exclusive shows that I've done in the past. It will be a video episode. I'll be showing video clips. I will be showing pictures of the score with different details pointed out. These have been really fun episodes in the past. And this will be also a special episode because it will be acting as a fundraiser. Now, I very intentionally do not talk about politics on this show, and I will not be talking about politics during these American episodes, but this episode specifically on Appalachian Spring will be a fundraiser for the Harris-Walz campaign as well as other Democratic candidates for the November election. There will be an Eventbrite link in the show notes, and I will pin an Eventbrite link to the Sticky Notes Facebook page. It'll be a really fun episode talking all about this quintessentially American work. I will also, for people buying tickets to that show, there will be some extra Sticky Notes merchandise. For the first time, I'm going to have merchandise as part of that show. I really hope you will join us. All the proceeds for that show will be going to candidates across the country who are committed to defending democracy. Thank you so much, and I really hope you enjoy the beginning of this American series on Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. Quote, "It was on the train, with its steely rhythms, its rattly bang, that is so often so stimulating to a composer. I frequently hear music in the very heart of the noise. And there I suddenly heard and even saw on paper the complete construction of the Rhapsody from beginning to end. No new themes came to me, but I worked on the thematic material already in my mind and tried to conceive the composition as a whole. I heard it as a sort of musical kaleidoscope of America, of our vast melting pot, of our unduplicated national pep, of our metropolitan madness. By the time I reached Boston, I had a definite plot of the piece." That was George Gershwin talking about writing Rhapsody in Blue, one of the most popular pieces of American classical music of the 20th century. But is the Rhapsody in Blue classical music, or is it jazz? It's certainly played on many more classical concerts than it is on jazz concerts. It uses a full orchestra, though that's not what it was originally written for, and the greatest soloists of the classical field regularly play the concerto on so-called serious classical concerts. But on the other hand, the structure of the piece is anything but classical. And there's ample room for improvisation, though most classical pianists don't improvise when they play the piece. So, which is it? Well, the answer is a bit of both, which probably is one of the main reasons for its enduring popularity. There are very few pieces that put a smile on your face like Rhapsody in Blue. And so today we'll explore this most American of pieces, talking about the amazing story of its conception, Gershwin's quest to be accepted by the great classical composers of the day, and of course, the music itself. All this and more is coming right up on Sticky Notes. The story of Rhapsody in Blue has to start with the band leader Paul Whiteman. Paul Whiteman is not as well known nowadays, but at the time he was one of the great band leaders of the 20s and 30s, and he was often billed as the king of jazz. Naturally, this was a bit controversial, as some black jazz musicians accused Whiteman, who was white, of appropriating their music and scrubbing it of its character. Then again, other musicians such as Duke Ellington praised Whiteman, saying, quote, "Paul Whiteman was known as the king of jazz, and no one as yet has come near carrying that title with more certainty and dignity." Whiteman started off as a violist in the San Francisco Symphony, but later moved away from traditional classical music in order to form his own band, the Paul Whiteman Orchestra. This band would soon transition into what was then called dance music, and Whiteman and his band immediately became incredibly popular. Whiteman soon became one of the most powerful band leaders in the country, making over $1 million a year, a stunning figure for the time. But why was he controversial? Well, Whiteman believed in his own conception of jazz, one that was much less based on improvisation than it was on snappy tunes, clean orchestration, and most importantly, a fully written out structure. Sounds almost classical. Critics nowadays often dismiss Whiteman's conception of jazz as a kind of bastardized, cleaned-up version of jazz that scrubbed the music of its essential character. And you can certainly hear the difference between Whiteman's orchestra of the time.
Now don't forget it, there'll come a time when you'll regret it. Someday, when you grow lonely, your heart will break like mine and you'll want me only after you've gone away.
And the music being made at the same time by someone like Louis Armstrong.
Is anyone finer in the state of Carolina? If there is, then you know, show to me. Dinah, the Dixon blazing, we love the city gazing to the eyes of Dinah me. Baby, every night, one eye, shake with fine song, cause my dynamite, change your mind, Bobby, this is your name. Don't you want to, don't China, baby, I'll have a new.
But with all this said, Whiteman's band really was the way many Americans were introduced to jazz. Interestingly, Paul Whiteman was always eager to work with black musicians and wanted to collaborate with black musicians far more often than he did. But he was always steered away from this by his managers, who said that working with black musicians in certain parts of the country would be career suicide. Whiteman was first and foremost a businessman, and so this version of jazz became widely popular in America at the same time that many black musicians of the time were being ignored. This is a part of the legacy of the time, and the conception of Rhapsody in Blue is a part of this history, because Rhapsody in Blue would almost certainly not exist in the form that it does now without the Paul Whiteman Band. It was 1924. Whiteman was continuing his push for the Whiteman Band version of jazz to be accepted into modern and much more formal concert halls. He booked the Aeolian Concert Hall in New York and began putting his program together, with the moniker, An Experiment in Modern Music. Can you imagine how few people would show up to a concert like that today? Well, in 1924, Whiteman was terrified as well, but I'll let him describe in his own words what happened next. Quote, I trembled at our temerity when we made out the list of patrons and patronesses for the concert. But in a few days I exulted at our daring, for the acceptances began to come in, from Damrosch, Godofsky, Heifetz, Chrysler, McCormick, Rachmaninoff, Rosenthal, Stokowski, Stravinsky. As you can tell, these were some of the leading lights of the classical and jazz worlds, and they were all coming to hear Paul Whiteman's new experiment. As Whiteman began conceiving of the program, he decided to ask a young 25-year-old composer, George Gershwin, to contribute a piece for piano and Whiteman's orchestra. Gershwin said no, due to time constraints. And now you'll see why Whiteman was known as one of the great businessmen of his age. Gershwin was Whiteman's hook, the way he was going to get the big classical names to come. Gershwin, even though he was only 25, was already a huge Broadway star, with his innovative and remarkably tuneful music already catching headlines. He had become well known in both the jazz and classical worlds for Blue Monday, a jazz opera. Whiteman, simply put, needed Gershwin in order for the concert to create interest in the classical crowd, but Gershwin had said no. Well, Whiteman had a trick up his sleeve. On January 3rd, 1924, Gershwin was playing billiards with his brother Ira, when Ira noticed a strange article in the New York Tribune about a concert put on by Paul Whiteman. In the concert, Gershwin was apparently contributing a jazz concerto. George was stunned, of course, he had said no. But Whiteman had simply gone ahead as if George had said yes, and scheduled the piece to be performed, thinking that if it was advertised, Gershwin would not actually be able to say no. And that wasn't all. The concert was in 3 weeks, scheduled for February 12th. Gershwin had never written a piece for orchestra before, and so he dashed off the piano score and handed it to Whiteman's arranger, Ferde Groffet, who orchestrated it for him for Whiteman's band. The concert itself was actually a bit of a failure. Whiteman announced to the audience at the beginning of the concert that the program was, quote, purely educational, and was meant to show that classical music and jazz could be integrated together, and that it would, quote, at least provide a stepping stone, which will make it very simple for the masses to understand, and therefore enjoy symphony and opera. Remember that among the audience were some of the absolutely leading lights of classical music, Rachmaninoff, Stravinsky, Heifetz, and Chrysler. This message of simplicity, and some would say condescension, might not have been the right message to send to an audience that was pretty cultured and aware of the goings-on in the world. There was another problem. The concert was really, really long. Here's the program of the 26 numbers that were performed that afternoon, plus their subheadings. True Form of Jazz. 1. 10 Years Ago, Livery Stable Blues. 2. With Modern Embellishment, Mama Loves Papa. Comedy selections. 1. Origin of Yes, We Have No Bananas. 2. Instrumental comedy. So, This Is Venice. Contrast. Legitimate scoring versus jazzing. 1. Selection in true form, as in classical form, whispering. 2. Same selection with jazz treatment. Recent compositions with modern score. 1. Limehouse Blues. 2. I Love You. 3. Raggedy Ann. An experiment. Zez Confrey, piano, accompanied by the orchestra. 1. Medley popular airs. 2. Kitten on the keys. 3. Ice cream and art. 4. Nickel in the slot. Flavoring a selection with borrowed themes. Russian Rose. Semi-symphonic arrangement of popular melodies, consisting of 1. Alexander's Ragtime Band. 2. A Pretty Girl is Like a Melody. 3. Orange Blossoms in California. a suite of serenades. 1. Spanish, 2. Chinese, 3. Cuban, 4. Oriental. Adaptation of standard selections on dance rhythm. 1. Pale Moon, 2. To a Wild Rose, 3. Chansonnette. George Gershwin, piano, accompanied by the orchestra. A Rhapsody in Blue. Now I'm leaving out the last piece in the program for a moment. Gershwin was second to last, and the audience was exhausted. Apparently a lot of the selections had sounded pretty similar, and the air ventilation in the hall was broken. But Gershwin sat down at the piano, and the audience came to life. That is until the final piece in the program, which might be the strangest programming decision that I've ever seen since I saw a program of the New York Philharmonic from the 50s that featured Mahler's Sixth Symphony, which is 90 minutes long, and one of the darkest and most tragic pieces of music ever written, on the first half of a concert, followed by Gershwin's Concerto in F on the second. So the final piece on this experiment in modern music was Pomp and Circumstance by Elgar. Yeah, the graduation song. I have no idea why Whiteman wanted to put this on the concert. It wasn't modern, it has less than nothing to do with jazz, and had even less to do with Gershwin. But either way, the concert was over, and there was a clear favorite and buzz coming out of the hall. Gershwin had scored a major success with his Rhapsody in Blue. Now, amazingly, but maybe not surprisingly, the piece wasn't really finished at that first performance. Gershwin had not had time to write out the many cadenzas or solo passages in the piece. So, like any good jazz musician, he improvised them, and nodded to Whiteman when it was time for the orchestra to come in. We'll get to this later, but many pianists are starting to make improvising the cadenzas a sort of tradition in the piece. The New York Times critic Olin Downs did not enjoy this concert very much. Here are some choice quotations from his sardonic review. Quote, "The pianist gathered about him some 5 fellow performers. The man with the clarinet wore a battered top hat that had ostensibly seen better days. Sometimes he wore it and sometimes played into it. The man with the trombone played it as is, but also on occasion picked up a bathtub or something of the kind from the floor and blew into that. The instruments made odd, unseemly sounds. The instrumentalists rocked about. Jests permissible in musical terms but otherwise not printable were passed between these friends of music. It was, should we blush to say it, a phase of America. It reminded the writer of someone's remark that an Englishman entered a place as if he were its master, whereas an American entered as if she didn't care who in blazes the master might be. Something like that was in this music." But Downs reserved most of his review for Gershwin's Rhapsody. He wasn't bowled over, but what he said in the first few lines of his long section about Gershwin really settled in as the dominant viewpoint in the classical world. Quote, "Then stepped upon the stage, sheepishly, a lank and dark young man, George Gershwin. He was to play the piano part in the first public performance of his Rhapsody in Blue for piano and orchestra. This composition shows extraordinary talent, just as it also shows a young composer with aims that go far beyond those of his ilk, struggling with a form of which he is far from being master. It is important to bear both these facts in mind in estimating the composition. Often Mr. Gershwin's purpose is defeated by technical immaturity. But in spite of that technical immaturity, a lack of knowledge of how to write effectively for piano alone or in combination with orchestra, an unconscious attempt to rhapsodize in the manner of Franz Liszt, a naivete which at times stresses something unimportant while something of value and effectiveness goes by so quickly that it is lost. In spite of all this, he has expressed himself in a significant and, on the whole, highly original manner." You can see how Downs gives about 19 backhanded compliments there. But that is actually how many people perceived of the piece, extraordinary tunes that are just pasted together. But first, what is a rhapsody? A rhapsody is an episodic piece which is free in its structure. It gives an improvisatory feel and is not as tightly wound as a typical classical structure. Some would say that Gershwin nailed that title exactly. But others, such as Leonard Bernstein, even though he loved the piece and performed it regularly, said it was, quote, not a composition at all, but a string of terrific tunes, stuck together with a thin paste of flour and water. Now, I love quoting bad reviews or middling reviews like the ones you've heard on this show because of their historical humor value. So here's another one that Gershwin received from the New York Tribune. Quote, how trite, feeble, and conventional the tunes are. How sentimental and vapid the harmonic treatment, under its disguise of fussy and futile counterpoint. Weep over the lifelessness of the melody and harmony. So derivative, so stale, so inexpressive. Now, despite these kind words, the piece was an immediate and lasting success. The recording had sold 1 million copies in 3 years and was so popular that the Whiteman Band made the main tune of Rhapsody in Blue their theme song and would advertise concerts on the radio with the slogan, everything new but the Rhapsody in Blue. Okay, now that we've introduced the piece, let's head into it now and see if we can make some sense of this Rhapsody, those terrific tunes, and see if we can make that thin paste of flour and water into something a little bit more substantial. The piece opens, of course, with that famous clarinet glissando. This might be one of the most recognizable motives in all of Western classical music. United Airlines made it even more famous in their ads, and it was all the result of not Gershwin, but the clarinetist in Paul Whiteman's band, Ross Gorman. Gorman smeared the scale that Gershwin had written down into that iconic slide, and Gershwin, sitting at the piano, immediately said that it had to be repeated and then written down. Thus, a tradition was born, and we are off onto the main theme, the recurring motive from the piece. This motive almost serves as the watchword for the piece. Whenever Gershwin needs to change gears or go back to something, he will use this theme as both a grand and powerful statement or as a transitionary motive. Gershwin also introduces a second major theme in this opening. This slightly pompous theme, making liberal use of that lowered seventh, the key to the blues scale, will also show up all over the 16 to 18 minutes of the piece. Now, just a quick note about the recordings I'm using. I'll use a few during the show today because there are a few different versions of the piece. There's the original for piano and jazz band, which we'll talk about a little bit later, a fully orchestrated version for piano and classical orchestra, and then there's a recording of Gershwin himself playing the entire piece on a piano roll. To me, this recording has that extra special quality of the composer's hands themselves. So even though it lacks the grandeur of the orchestra version, it might be my favorite recording of the piece. After a few statements of the main theme, we're into our first cadenza, a short one, and one that again Gershwin likely improvised at the first performance. Here he plays the written-out version of the cadenza, which he wrote down later. This is the one that appears in every score. Right away, you can hear that this piece really is an amalgam of jazz and classical music. Gershwin plays driving, hard rhythms that would be comfortable either in jazz or in classical music, because blurring the lines was something Gershwin always did in his quest for acceptance from both worlds. He would famously ask star composers like Stravinsky and Ravel for composition lessons. We're never sure which response is apocryphal and which response is real, but apparently Ravel said to Gershwin, quote, "Why be a second-rate Ravel when you can be a first-rate Gershwin?" Stravinsky apparently asked Gershwin how much money he makes, and then when Gershwin told him, said, quote, "Perhaps I should study with you." Now, Gershwin doesn't really develop themes like a fully classical composer would. This cadenza is both a virtuoso showpiece, and also it starts to preview the syncopated rhythms that will dominate later sections. It also shows off the emotional range of the main theme. It can be brash and confident, or seductive and airy. Now, one thing you can hear in the Gershwin recording is that he was an absolutely fantastic pianist. He plays the piece at a much faster tempo than it is normally heard today, and in his performance, he emphasizes the syncopation that is at the heart of jazz and had only begun to be experimented with so effectively by composers like Stravinsky. The Rachmaninoffs, Stravinskys, and Stokowskis in the audience must have been impressed by passages like these. And with a big flourish, we are into the main tune again, brash and macho in the best sense. It's no wonder that Woody Allen used this theme so effectively in his movie Manhattan. It seems to embody that fearlessness, that energy, and that slight rudeness that makes New York so wonderful and so challenging at the same time. More flatted sevenths and a statement of the theme in the low brass take us to our third theme, one that I find very closely related to the opening theme in its character and its rhythmic drive. This is the so-called train theme, named because of the spinning circles of the accompaniment in the low strings and saxophones. Gershwin certainly owes a debt to Ferré-Groffet's brilliant orchestration. One of my favorite bits of this piece is the transition from the main tune to the train theme. Groffet has the trumpets play tremolo as fast as possible as the music fizzes up and overflows with energy. As the train comes to a stop, Gershwin comes to one of the many pauses in the piece, and this is where that flower and water comes in. Gershwin simply goes back to the main tunes, but this time, it's the first two tunes put together. We have the second theme responded to by the main opening theme. This little bit of thematic development is about all we get in the piece, but I would argue that it doesn't really matter. In character and in feeling, this music all makes sense to me so far. For me, the music can be split into three parts. The first fast section, bookended by cadenzas, a slow movement, and then a fast third section. I think, not coincidentally, exactly the structure of a typical classical concerto. The thing is, that first section, it doesn't conform at all to a typical first movement. At the moment of another slowdown and pause in energy, Gershwin starts what seems to be a mini development of the train theme. But just as it really gets going, Gershwin changes gears again and goes into a long, extended cadenza. This is one place where I get a bit frustrated with the stop and start feeling of the piece. It's as if Gershwin isn't quite sure where his initial idea is going to go in the end. Now that's the kind of mark of the greatest composers. When Beethoven, for example, wrote a theme, he worked and worked and worked to make sure he knew what the theme would result in at the end and how he would get there. Gershwin doesn't do this, at least in the Rhapsody in Blue. Instead, a theme appears, and when he's done with it, he dispenses with it. In this case, he does go into that extended cadenza. Now, many pianists these days are starting to tinker with these cadenzas, which is giving the piece a new, fresh take. Pianists such as Aaron Diehl, as well as Makoto Ozone, have become famous for their improvisations in the piece. And it's a reminder that many classical musicians, including myself, aren't really taught how to improvise. It's an extremely important part of making music, and it's a shame that more classical musicians don't know how to do it. As for me, when I've done the piece with Aaron, for example, I really enjoy putting in my score the same thing Gershwin put in for Paul Whiteman at the premiere. At the end of the blank page marked cadenza, Gershwin simply wrote to Whiteman, "Wait for nod." Gershwin writes one more variation of the main theme in probably the weakest moment of the piece. I think he's going for something sly and a bit flirtatious, but the effect comes off more as a thin transition to yet another cadenza than anything else. Interestingly, in Gershwin's piano roll recording, he skips this section entirely. I'm not sure if it was because the full piece couldn't fit on the discs of the time, but Leonard Bernstein also often cut this section, because it's generally agreed that it's the weakest in the piece. But we then move on to perhaps my favorite part of the piece, the slow movement, so to speak, featuring one of Gershwin's greatest tunes. apparently Gershwin improvised this tune at a party, and his brother Ira convinced him to include it in the piece. I can't think of a tune more emblematic of the supposed American spirit, warm, friendly, and open. It's as if Jimmy Stewart puts his arm around you and tells you a story. Now, one performance note about this music, which in my opinion is not that easy to play, even though this theme is so lovable. If you play this music too sentimentally, too expressively, it can sound like bad Tchaikovsky, overly schmaltzy and insincere. In my mind, and this is something that I'll talk about a lot on that Appalachian Spring show I mentioned, this music has to be played simply and honestly, without too much vibrato and over-expression. It's music that speaks for itself if it is played with gentle conviction. It should never sound over the top. This is made a lot easier if you listen to the original jazz band recording with Gershwin as the soloist. The band takes this section at a much quicker tempo than it is normally taken today, and I think it gets that beautiful, gentle conviction right on the spot. Gershwin takes us to yet another cadenza, which will lead to the final, third large section of the piece. This is my favorite cadenza, since Gershwin now starts to include music that is definitely taken from Cuban music. Gershwin always loved Cuban music, and he makes a loving homage to it in this cadenza. In the final section, Gershwin uses the technique of stride piano. There is an excitement and drive here that is unparalleled. He also starts to bring some themes back. In the fully orchestrated version, this passage always tends to be a balance problem. Grofé seemed to get overexcited and put in a few too many instruments. Or perhaps Gershwin and Grofé wanted an all-out cacophony here. And then, of course, what could finish this piece better than returning to one more explosion of the main theme, marked to be played not too slow. But again, I want to play a couple of clips of that jazz band recording. For example, the very beginning, that famous glissando, sounds a little bit different in that original recording. And the very end of the piece here, Gershwin writes that it should not be too slow, but a lot of people today ignore that. Listen to how fast it is in the jazz band recording. For me, this is gold, and every time I do the piece, I try to infuse some elements from that jazz band recording into our performances. Now, many composers tried to make jazz a part of their classical music. Gershwin, trained as both a jazz and a classical musician, was by far the most successful in this. I've talked about his other works before, but the Concerto in F is as much a classical concerto as it is a jazz one. And while the structure of Rhapsody in Blue is often criticized, even by me, it still, in its outlined form, is a 3-movement concerto with a fast, slow, fast structure. Gershwin's feat at marrying a certain form of jazz with classical music is even more remarkable when you hear some of the other efforts by other composers, many of whom were some of the greatest of the 20th century. Here's Stravinsky's Ragtime for 11 instruments. It's not terrible or anything, but it definitely doesn't sound like jazz. It sounds like an appropriation of jazz rhythms inside of a classical piece. Shostakovich's jazz suites sound even less like jazz. To be fair, Shostakovich was listening to sanitized records that had nothing to do with the jazz actually being played in New Orleans and other cities in the US, but it's still funny to see this piece performed today, unironically. Darius Milhaud was one of the more successful composers at using jazz, and unsurprisingly this had a lot to do with him going to Harlem and studying jazz musicians before writing his music. His La Création du Monde, The Creation of the World, while still sounding very classical, goes a long way to capturing that authentic feeling. Some would say La Création du Monde is more authentically jazzy than even Gershwin. And then on the other hand, there were composers like Duke Ellington, who wrote jazz into classical music in an incredibly successful way. One of my favorite pieces of the 20th century is Duke Ellington's Harlem, a piece that would be played a lot more often if it wasn't scored for 5 saxophones. Luckily, I'm going to be able to do this piece twice, once in Aalborg and once in Lille, and I hope much more often. It is a fantastic piece of American classical music with that huge jazz element. In the end, Gershwin, in his Rhapsody in Blue, did something unique. He captured the energy of a city, of a train, of life, through an ingenious amalgamation of jazz and classical music. Gershwin was a rare composer who was respected on all sides of the spectrum, from jazz to classical. from his good friend and supporter Arnold Schoenberg all the way to Duke Ellington. Written in just 3 weeks, the Rhapsody in Blue, for all of its minor faults, remains one of my favorite pieces. And the truth is that it is uniquely American. It's hard to think of a place where a Jewish composer from New York could write a jazz piece influenced heavily by black musicians, and then perform it with a jazz band for an audience filled with Russian émigré star composers like Rachmaninoff and Stravinsky. It's one of those concerts that I think we all would have loved to attend. Just to imagine the feeling of hearing that first glissando for the first time. Thanks so much for listening to Sticky Notes today. We'll have some more exciting stuff for you next week, so don't miss our next episode. If you like what you heard today, please feel free to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts. It really helps the show gain more visibility. And please send any questions to stickynotespodcast@gmail.com or my Facebook page @StickyNotesPodcast. And if you'd like to support the podcast monetarily, just head over to patreon.com/StickyNotesPodcast. And keep your eyes open for that Eventbrite link for the fundraiser on October 5th at 4 p.m. on Copeland's Appalachian Spring. Thanks, and I'll talk to you again after a while.